Good day. Today is Wednesday, 2nd April 2025. It is the day which Donald Trump has referred to as Liberation Day. It's the day when we're supposed to be seeing all of these new tariffs imposed by the United States across the world. Some suggest against all countries, and in other words, tariffs that will be imposed right across the board. Others are saying that they will be more limited, that they will target specific countries more than other countries. Nobody seems quite sure. There's also, I should say, continued debate and discussion about whether these tariffs are legal or not, whether they violate the provisions in the US Constitution, which require Congress to approve these tariffs. Anyway, there are many unanswered questions about them. I suspect that this is something that we will be discussing extensively on the Duran over the next couple of days until we know more clearly what Donald Trump and his administration are likely to do over the next couple of days. I think it's premature today to talk further about them. I'm going to just make two quick observations about certain recent developments in the United States. Firstly, in relation to the attempts by Donald Trump and his administration to try to normalize relations with Russia, about which I will be returning shortly. We've now had certain moves in the Senate which again highlight the extent of hostility, not just in the Senate, but specifically in the Republican Party in the Senate, to any steps by the president to normalize relations with Russia. Lindsey Graham has been trying to put a package of sanctions together, threatening apparently all sorts of secondary sanctions against all sorts of third countries. These are supposed to be bone-breaking sanctions against Russia. It's extraordinary that people continue to harbor the myth that sanctions against Russia can achieve those sort of objectives. But anyway, Lindsey Graham has put together some kind of a sanctions package, and on a first vote, it seems, something like 50 senators supported them, and that included 25 Republican senators, almost half the Senate. It's not the full Senate, but 25 Republican senators apparently supported Lindsey Graham's initiative. So it's clear that the point often made by people like Professor Mearsheimer, that Donald Trump still faces strong opposition within the American political class to the moves he's making to try to improve relations with Russia is true. Against that, Trump has had one significant recent success. The Senate Armed Services Committee has apparently approved has apparently decided to confirm its support for Eldridge Colby's appointment as Deputy Secretary of Defense. This has been a controversial appointment, to put it mildly. There's been strong opposition from various quarters, including supporters of Israel, but also supporters of Ukraine and supporters of NATO, or at least of the US presence in NATO. Colby is known or presents himself as one of the more realist figures in the administration or future administration. He is apparently keen to focus on the Asia Pacific, though I ought to say that he's apparently someone who does not want, or says he does not want, all-out war with China, but he's mostly focused on the Pacific. He's been writing articles in places like the Financial Times saying that the Europeans need to take more steps to defend themselves because the United States has to prioritize other places? Well, he hasn't yet been confirmed, but he has now received the backing of the Armed Services Committee, and that does make his confirmation much more likely. If Colby is confirmed, then I think the last major figure that Trump needs to complete his national security team will be in place. Just saying. So we see that Trump still has momentum in Congress, but clearly there is still a significant amount of opposition to what he's trying to do just below the surface. And that may, by the way, go far to explain some of the contradictory statements which he made the other day. Anyway, before going back to all of this, before returning to the topic of the negotiations and the discussions between the Americans and the Russians and all that, I think it's worth returning to the topic with which I started my program yesterday, which is the coordinating moves that the Chinese and the Russians are making with each other, which are highlighted by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister's ongoing visit to Moscow. He is still in Moscow. Yesterday, he had a meeting with President Putin. The Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, was there, as, by the way, was Yuri Ushakov, the Putin's major advisor on foreign policy. We've not been provided by the Kremlin with a readout of the meeting, but we do have a fair amount of information about the meeting. Putin made some very friendly comments, which I'm not going to read out here. But they were, the usual gracious statements and compliments and requests to pass on Putin's best wishes to Xi Jinping, and to say that the Russians are welcoming Xi Jinping's coming to Moscow to attend the Victory Day parade on the 9th of May. And there were also certain comments made by Wang Yi, which the Kremlin has also reported. And they're relatively short. As I said, most of the meeting would obviously have been very private. But this is an extract of what the Kremlin says. Wang Yi said, "Thanks to the personal attention and efforts of our respective leaders, political mutual trust constantly gets stronger. Strategic coordination tightens. Practical cooperation deepens. The great cause of national rebirth of our countries is guaranteed, and our common interests in pressing international regional affairs are protected. Cooperation between China and Russia is never directed against third parties and does not succumb to impediments coming from outside. We will not tread water when it comes to advancing bilateral relations, and we have a broad prospects open to us. Our friendship is not based on fleeting considerations, but is of a long-term nature." Now, that is clearly all directed at the United States, at the Trump administration. Note what Wang Yi is saying. You might be trying to win over the Russians against us, but it's not going to happen. We trust each other. Our trust is getting stronger. Our strategic coordination is tightening. We are engaged in the great cause of national rebirth of our countries, and we're working together with each other, and we share common interests in pressing international regional affairs. But then notice these particular words. Cooperation between China and Russia is never directed against third parties and does not succumb to impediments coming from outside. Does not succumb to impediments coming from outside. If the United States imposes secondary sanctions on China or imposes tariffs on China because it is importing Russian oil, then so be it. China and Russia, the relationship between these two countries is too important for each, for either to sacrifice because of whatever it is that the United States might be trying to do. The Russians will not be persuaded to give up their relationship with China, their strategic cooperation with China, because the United States wants them to. And China will not scale down its cooperation with Russia, for example, by buying Russian oil products because of economic threats made against it by the United States. So that's a clear statement, by the way, of the Chinese position. Now, it's been repeated in an editorial an article by Global Times, which clearly takes its cue from Wang Yi's words. But Global Times says this is in an article, China and Russia are friends forever and never enemies. And it reads, the Chinese-Russian relationship poses no threat to any country in the world, nor is it subject to interference or influence by any third party. It sets a model up for a new type of international relations between major powers in the modern era and is a vital stabilizing force in a turbulent and changing world. And again, we see those words. It is not subject to interference or influence by any third party. So Wang Yi is repeating the same thing all over again. Well, rather, the Global Times is repeating again the points that Wang Yi has made. Now, just to say, there's also been a meeting between Wang Yi and Lavrov. The Chinese have not yet provided their own readout of this meeting, at least not in English. But the readout that the Russian Foreign Ministry has provided is quite interesting, and it follows very much along the lines of Wang Yi's comments. We read that the Russian leader, that's to say Putin, welcomed Wang Yi's visit to Russia, praised the state of Russia-China relations, which continue to make dynamic strides amid intense turbulence, and expressed readiness to continue enhancing comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation with China. Sergei Lavrov and Wang Yi had an in-depth exchange of views on the schedule of bilateral contacts at the highest and high levels, as well as on certain issues of practical and humanitarian cooperation. Now notice the bilateral contacts at the highest and high levels. Highest levels means Putin and Xi. So they are looking forward to several meetings with each other this year. Just to say, not just the one on the 9th of May and perhaps the one in September, when Putin is known to be going to China to attend the Victory Day celebrations there, victory over Japan, by the way. There will be other meetings, the BRICS summits, at Shanghai Cooperation Organization summits. There will be several meetings between Putin and Xi, and they're being carefully prepared. And just to emphasize the point, the Russian readout then goes on to say, both foreign ministers emphasized the importance of building up coordination on international issues within the United Nations. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, the G20, APEC, that's the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, and other multilateral facilities and forums. And of course, when we talk about coordination on international issues, that obviously also means coordination at the UN, in the UN Security Council. The Chinese and the Russians work closely together at the UN Security Council. Just to say. The ministers also discussed new security risks in the Asia-Pacific region, and I'm going to turn to that in a moment, and touched upon a number of regional issues related to the situation on the Korean Peninsula, Iran's nuclear program, and the situation in Central Asia. So these are quite interesting because we hear about security risks in the Asia-Pacific region. That's clearly about the American build-up, the prioritization by the United States of the Asia-Pacific region. It clearly also relates to Taiwan. They also discuss the situation in the Korean Peninsula. The Russians will have wanted to brief the Chinese fully about their interaction with Kim Jong-un's government in Pyongyang and all of that. Notice the bland reference to Iran's nuclear program. It's as if Iran were indeed engaged in a nuclear program. The Russians deny this. Rather, the Iranians themselves deny this. But it is the case that they have now increased uranium enrichment to 60% levels, and they have apparently built up a significant stockpile. There are reports that one of Khamenei's aides, Ari Larijani, who has actually worked as an Iranian diplomat and chief negotiator in the JCPOA negotiations, and from memory might once have been Iran's foreign minister, though I'm not absolutely certain about this. But Larijani has apparently made statements that if the United States and Israel do attack Iran, then Iran may be obliged to reconsider its decision not to develop, not to acquire nuclear weapons. In other words, if there's an American-Israeli attack on Iran, Iran could be threatening that it would decide, in light of that it had no alternative but to go nuclear. So that's quite a dramatic statement. I haven't been able to find it, by the way, but it has been reported in parts of the international media, so I assume it's true. Now, all of this is happening following reports that the Iranian leadership, President Pezeshkian, has apparently replied to the letter that Donald Trump sent to the Iranian leadership, threatening military action in 2 months unless Iran came to a deal on nuclear weapons within that period. Apparently, Pezeshkian's letter rejects the ultimatum completely, but is in some respects conciliatory. It says that Iran is not prepared to engage the United States in direct talks because doing so obviously would not succeed. The Iranians have had bitter experience in the past with the JCPOA, that negotiations that they enter into with the United States can be reversed by future administrations, as Donald Trump's own actions in the past have shown. So the Iranians are not prepared to enter into direct negotiations with the United States. However, they are prepared, apparently, to negotiate with the United States through third parties. Now, that brings me back to this discussion, this talk, which I floated some weeks ago, indeed before Trump became president, that the Russians, who have just signed a major strategic partnership agreement with security provisions for Iran, might be prepared to act as some kind of guarantor and mediating third party in talks to come to some kind of agreement between the United States and Iran. Now, that letter, that appears to have been also discussed by the Americans with the Russians. It was apparently brought up in the discussions between Rubio and Lavrov in Riyadh, which took place about 4 weeks ago now. And it was also apparently discussed over the course of the first telephone call between Putin and Trump, which took place in February. Anyway, Pezeshkian, in his letter to Trump, apparently says that Iran is open to this idea. Now, it could be that it's not just the Russians who would be the third party. It could also be other countries, China, for example, the BRIC states, maybe some of the Arab states, Saudi Arabia as well. The point is, Iran may come back and say that the kind of deal that might be agreed is that Iran gives up its nuclear stockpile, it gets transferred to Russia, the United States then lifts sanctions. There would probably be a much more structured phasing of these various steps than was the case with the JCPOA. And in return, Iran would receive security guarantees from perhaps Russia and China in terms of protection against attack, future attack by the Israel and or the United States. And most likely that would come with some significant arms packages as well. So it could be that some kind of negotiation involving the United States, Iran, Russia, and who knows, maybe other countries, including China, is being prepared. And it looks like from the readout, the Russian readout of the meeting between Wang Yi and Lavrov, that the Russians and the Chinese are in discussion with each other about this. Anyway, moving on, the next sentence of the Russian readout of the discussion between Wang Yi and Lavrov is extremely interesting. It says that Lavrov and Wang Yi also discussed prospects for building a new security entity in Eurasia amid stagnating Euro-Atlantic mechanisms. Now, what does that mean exactly? Does it mean building a new security architecture in Western Eurasia, replacing NATO? Possibly. I mean, that one interpretation of those words might actually point in that direction. But what about the use of the word entity? They also discuss prospects for building a new security entity in Eurasia. It doesn't sound like a concept for a security structure. I have to say, an entity sounds like some kind of coalition or bloc, or perhaps an alliance. Just saying. Is it a hint that, especially given the reference to the stagnating Euro-Atlantic mechanisms, the Russians and the Chinese are in discussions about some new structure bringing the two countries together that would involve more overt mechanisms for security cooperation, something closer to an alliance than anything we have seen up to now. Well, I don't know, and I don't want to guess. These words look to me very ambiguous, and intentionally so. No doubt we will find out in due course. And then we read from the Russian readout that the sides exchanged views on the prospects for settling the Ukraine crisis and underscored the importance of eliminating the underlying causes of the conflict as a basis for achieving durable peace agreements. So China is completely on side with Russia about this. A mere ceasefire, which is what the Americans are proposing, is not enough. There has to be a final agreement, and the Chinese and the Russians clearly envisage this as being very similar to what the Russians are proposing, to Putin's June 2024 proposals on how the conflict in Ukraine should end. And then we're told that the talks were held in a friendly and open atmosphere, which is typical of Russian-Chinese relations. The ministers emphasized overlapping or close positions on the main bilateral issues and global agenda items, which fully meets the high spirit of Russia-China strategic partnership. So anyway, an interesting readout. It contains it begs questions. Let me put it that way, but it suggests something is going on, something is in the works over Iran, though that isn't to mean that anything will necessarily come. And it also suggests that China and Russia have some kind of plan for Eurasia involving a security dimension. It could be a new security architecture which will replace NATO eventually, if the Western powers agree, or it could be something that takes us rather closer to an alliance. Just saying. Anyway, as Wang Yi has been in in Russia, the Chinese military have been conducting a massive military exercise around Taiwan. And there's another article about this in Global Times. People's Liberation Army drills, subdue demons and vanquish evils, send a stern warning to Lai Ching-te, that's the president of Taiwan. And we're told that this has been a huge military exercise. And I'm not going to read the entire article in Global Times. The most interesting point that it makes is this one. Observers have noted that the joint exercises did not carry a code name, which precisely indicates that the PLA has normalized its operations in the Taiwan Straits. From honing combat readiness and familiarizing troops with battlefield conditions to enhancing joint operational capabilities and testing weaponry, every PLA exercise serves to build strength and ensure that no battle is fought unprepared. Behind this normalization is an increasingly sophisticated operational toolbox for operations in the Taiwan Straits with more diverse and flexible tactics. Now, anybody who thinks that these exercises are taking place as Wang Yi visits Moscow and coordinates with the Russians, anybody who thinks that this is just a coincidence, well, I think they would be gravely mistaken. There is no doubt at all that the Chinese are deliberately putting on a show of force. They have certainly registered the rhetoric coming from Washington about how the United States has refocused its defense priorities on China. They've certainly registered the fact that the United States is now talking about defending Taiwan, and that is one of the main reasons why China needs to have strong relations with Russia. It's foolish to think, as far too many people in the West, in the United States, still seem to do, that you can just pick off the one so as to be able to take on later the other. The Chinese know perfectly well that if they abided by American demands and stopped their relationship with China, with Russia, if they weakened Russia by refusing to buy Russian oil and such products, all that they would be doing ultimately would be weakening themselves, given that the United States has made it perfectly clear it is openly discussing Pete Hegseth's memo to the Pentagon. Makes no secret of this, that the United States is now coming after China in place of Russia. And as for the Russians, well, of course, from their point of view, they've been involved in too many things with the United States over the last 30, 40, 50 years, going all the way back to the détente era. Some would say going back further still. The historian Jeff Roberts has published in Brave New Europe, BNE, a wonderful article on Yalta, on the actual Yalta conference, Yalta and the myth of spheres of influence. He points out that there was no actual discussion between the Russians and the Americans at the Yalta conference in January 1945 about dividing Europe into spheres of influence. Instead, all the talk was in future cooperation based on the construction of the United Nations and the further development of the Grand Alliance that had been created during the Second World War to defeat Germany and the Axis powers. And there's no reason to doubt, there's no reason to think that in 1945, the Russians based their assumptions on the expectation that post-war that would continue. Now, I'm not going to revisit the history of the 1940s. I'm not going to say that one party was more guilty in bringing about the Cold War than any other party. There's far too much to be said about this. All I would say is this: the Russians have a very, very long history of dealing with the United States. They know how unpredictable relations between Russia and the United States tend to be. They will undoubtedly register the fact that 25 Republican senators have apparently broken ranks with Donald Trump and are supporting bone-crunching sanctions, what they believe will be bone-crunching sanctions against Russia. They would be absolutely foolish to invest all their hopes in a long-term friendship or stable relationship with the United States. They will negotiate toughly and hard to try to achieve some kind of stabilization in the relationship with the United States, at least for the time being, because they calculate correctly that this works at the moment to their advantage. But they are not foolish enough to suppose that this is going to be a guaranteed improvement in relations over the long term. And if we continue on this, I recently seen opinion polls in Russia which show that the general sentiment amongst Russians, not just, the elite Russians, not just people in the Kremlin, is the same. They too would welcome a normalization of relations with the United States, but there is little belief amongst the wider Russian public that the relationship with the United States will, over the long term, be anything other than adversarial. So, given that this is so, the Chinese and the Russians, who over the last 50 years have successfully rebuilt their relationship, and you have a long history of stable relations with each other, going all the way back to the 17th century, the period of the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s being an anomaly. Well, these two countries understand that a stable, long-term relationship with each other is the best guarantee for both. And if you look at these readouts, these commentaries about these meetings between Wang Yi and Putin and Wang Yi and Lavrov, you can see it all there. They talk about a long-term, stable, predictable relationship, and they see their relationship with each other as the sheet anchor, stabilizing to the extent that it can be stabilized the entire international system, given the volatile and unpredictable policy swings that you constantly get from the Western powers and the United States. So anyway, let's move on and now let's discuss the relationship between the Russians and the United States. And firstly, I'd like to mention that there's been a very interesting article in Bloomberg talking about how Trump, after making some critical comments about Putin on Friday, has now swung back. He's been more critical about Zelensky. He's saying that Zelensky will face serious consequences if Ukraine tries to renegotiate the mineral rights extraction deal, which is now much more than mineral rights. It's about pretty much all of Ukraine's resources, incidentally. Ukraine, by the way, is trying to renegotiate the deal. They would be negligent in terms of their own interests if they didn't. That's precisely what they're trying to do. The former Ukrainian president, Poroshenko, has spoken out against this proposed deal as well. He says it would be a betrayal of Ukraine's sovereignty if it were ever ratified and signed. So anyway, Trump has been very critical of the Ukrainians for doing that. He's made other statements about Zelensky, but he hasn't yet exactly reversed his critical comments about Putin, though he does seem to be rowing them back, and he has said that he still believes that he has a good and trusting relationship with Putin, and that Putin does generally want peace, and that he hopes that he can eventually reach that point in the discussions with Putin. Now, Bloomberg makes a very good point in this article. It's a point that we made on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I together, and I made it in these programs on this channel, which is that whilst the United States, whilst Trump has immense leverage over Ukraine as the effect on Ukraine of the brief pause on intelligence sharing and military supplies showed, the United States does not have the same level of leverage over Russia. Russia is already the most sanctioned country in the world. Bone-crushing sanctions are not going to crush Russian bones, whatever Lindsey Graham might think. We have already seen that China, now the biggest importer of Russian oil, looks likely to reject any threat made against it, against buying Russian oil. And by the way, I suspect India will do the same. India now needs Russian oil in order to try to contain price increases inside India itself. As the Russian energy minister, Mr. Novak, has pointed out, Russian oil is still trading more cheaply on global markets than other oil products are. So, bone-crushing sanctions won't work, and Bloomberg makes the point that as the third biggest producer of oil, restricting sales of Russian oil on global markets in the way that Trump appears to be threatening to try to do, what that is going to do is simply trigger increased inflationary pressures, which are inevitably going to affect the United States itself. This at a time when, despite growing indicators that we are moving into a recession environment, inflation seems to be increasing. There's inflation numbers in the United States have been growing. They've been growing significantly in Britain as well, by the way. And there's been a major uptick in prices, including prices for utilities in Britain this April. Latest reports, by the way, speak of gas reserves in Europe falling further into critical level territory. It's astonishing that this isn't getting the attention and the publicity that it should. But there is a strong possibility that we could see another energy shock at the end of this year towards the autumn, pushing up energy prices still further. And that doesn't even take into account what effect Trump's tariffs, whatever they are, might have. So it makes no sense for Donald Trump to make this situation even worse, this inflationary situation even worse, by taking action against Russian oil and gas exports that will simply push up energy costs and therefore overall inflation still further, pushing it back quite plausibly into double figures, such as we saw in 2022. That inflation destroyed the Democrats and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's prospects of re-election. It also destroyed the reputation of the Scholz government in Germany and of the Johnson, Truss, Sunak government in Britain. And if we get inflation like that all over again, it could very well be the end of Donald Trump also. So I don't believe he's going to do it. By the way, and on this point, I should say that Europe is currently stepping up its imports of LNG, liquefied natural gas, from Russia, presumably because of the problems in the European gas reserves. The attempt to put an economic squeeze on Hungary and Slovakia, the governments of Hungary and Slovakia, by cutting off their natural gas supplies from Russia, by getting Ukraine to agree transit of Russian gas across Ukraine in January. I've no doubt at all that that decision was instigated by the European Commission and that it was intended, as I said, to put the squeeze on Orban and Fico. Anyway, that has failed. Hungary and Slovakia have been able to import gas, continue to import gas, apparently in the same volumes from Russia. The gas is going through presumably the Turk Stream pipeline. It's then being sent to Hungary via Serbia. And Hungary, by the way, is now talking about concluding a military alliance with Serbia, which is an interesting development. We'll see where that goes. And Hungary then has been able to ship gas to Slovakia by increasing gas supplies through one of the pipelines that link Hungary and Slovakia. Anyway, put all that aside, we see that Europe cannot, for the moment, do without Russian gas. Its own gas situation is critical. Hungary and Slovakia are still able to receive Russian pipeline gas. Everywhere else in Europe, in Britain, the gas energy situation hangs by a thread, or so it seems to me. And, well, this isn't a conducive situation to start causing more problems and more trouble in the global energy market by following through with the sort of threats that Donald Trump is talking about. Again, people who advocate these things, when you read the articles that they write, almost invariably they overestimate the West's continued economic dominance and assume that the United States and the West have it within their economic power somehow to destroy Russia, and that it was only because the Biden administration, Sullivan and Blinken and all of the others, and Yellen and all the others, somehow held back that these sanctions that were imposed back in February 2022 turned out to be so much less effective than they turned out to be. This is a complete misunderstanding of the realities. Incidentally, the Russian energy minister, Mr. Novak, has recently made a number of points about the Russian oil and gas sector. He has again said that it accounts for 10% of Russia's GDP, far less than I think many people in the West assume, and 20% of the receipts of Russia's federal budget. 20%, not 50 or 60%, as again, I think many people assume. The point is that, as I've discussed many times, oil and gas receipts accounted for around 20% of Russian budget revenue, well, for at least the last 10 years, probably more, in fact. That share has been in steady decline, and over the last 3 years it has declined further, partly because other parts of the Russian economy have been growing faster, such as manufacturing and industry and all of that, but also because recently the Russian government conducted a tax reform, which means that the budget now receives more money from direct taxes than it used to do. So, again, there is a vast mythology about this, which the people who talk about sanctions never seem to be able to put behind them. I would add that I still read about the great overheating of the Russian economy, the inflation crisis that is supposed to be taking there. According to the central bank, the Russian central bank, inflation began to fall off significantly. In March, they're now predicting an overall rate of inflation of around 7% this year, significant decline, and they appear to think that inflation will fall back to close to the 4% target in the first half of 2026. Well, we'll see. I mean, they made similar predictions before. But there is clear indicators now that the economy is cooling off as a result of the interest rate hikes, and that this is indeed bringing inflation down, even whilst industrial production growth, particularly in manufacturing, continues to remain strong. So anyway, let's note all of this. Trump has enormous leverage over Zelensky, but he has much less leverage. In fact, if one has to be frank, he has no leverage at all over Vladimir Putin. At least he does not have coercive leverage as he does over Zelensky. No matter what endless numbers of commentators and pundits and editorial writers and those sort of people want to believe. Now, that doesn't mean, and I've discussed this many times, but I'm just going to say it again, that the Russians would not be amenable to some kind of deal over Ukraine. I mean, they undoubtedly would be. But it does mean that if that deal is done, it will have to be a deal on their terms. So that is a point which I really want to reiterate again. Now, the Russians have been talking about the situation overall. They've been discussing the situation, the negotiation situation between themselves and the Americans. And we've had a number of statements from Russian officials about the state of those negotiations. But before I turn to that, I want to discuss something that happened yesterday at a meeting of the Russian Security Council. Now, to repeat again, this is the most important decision-making body in Russia. It is the body that decides Russian foreign defense and, by the way, to a great extent, even domestic policies. And of course, it meets every week and it is chaired by Putin. Anyway, right at the beginning of this meeting, which took place yesterday, according to the Kremlin, in a part of the meeting, these meetings are strictly private. We don't get full readouts of what was discussed in them. But in this particular meeting, right at the beginning, the Kremlin wants us to know that Putin made this comment. He said, "Before we begin our discussion, I would like to ask Mr. Belousov, that is to say, the Russian defense minister, about the implementation of agreements regarding the cessation of strikes by Russia and Ukraine on their respective energy infrastructure systems." Now, the Russians have been complaining fiercely that they have respected the 30-day truce on attacks on the energy systems. The Ukrainians have disregarded this truce. And these words of Putin attracted a huge amount of attention in Russia, and they resulted in a further comment from one of the participants at the Security Council meeting, who was none other than the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And the Russian Foreign Ministry has a whole report about this, Lavrov's comments, and I will read it. It says, "At the very beginning of today's Security Council meeting, and before taking up the main issue of combating terrorist threats, President Putin had asked Defense Minister Andrei Belousov and myself, that's to say Lavrov, to provide an update on the status of our relations with the United States on the Ukrainian dossier. Andrei Belousov spoke precisely about the moratorium that was agreed upon at the suggestion of President Trump on March 18th during the telephone call between the President of Russia and the President of the United States. The moratorium is not being observed. All this time, the energy facilities of the Russian Federation have been coming under attacks with occasional short breaks of 1 to 2 days between them. Defense Minister Belousov listed the facilities targeted by Ukrainian drones over the period under review, including last night. My update went along the same lines. The Russian army is observing the moratorium that President Putin ordered to strictly comply with on March 18th. Remember, Putin said 7 drones were on their way to attack targets in Ukraine as they were having this call. The drones were destroyed by our own air defences and a jet fighter on duty that was up in the air at the time. Since then, we have been 100% compliant with that agreement with President Trump. We have passed a list of violations cited by Defense Minister Belousov to US National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. I forwarded this list to Secretary of State Marco Rubio and our representatives at the United Nations and the OSCE for them to use these concrete facts in their work and let everyone know the real worth of the words uttered by the current Ukrainian authorities, if this can even be called authorities. In addition to this topic, President Putin asked me to provide an update on other areas of work with the Americans, including matters that were discussed on March 24th in Riyadh, when experts from Russia and the United States met to discuss the revival, resumption and resuscitation of the grain deal. During the talks in Riyadh, we highly appreciated President Putin supported this assessment, the United States' willingness to eliminate obstacles created by illegal unilateral sanctions imposed on Russian grain and fertilizer exports. They have created tensions on global markets and difficulties for developing countries which face limited access to food and fertilizer. We supported the US willingness to act in this regard, which was laid out on paper after the March 24th meeting, and added specific proposals on how this could be done in practice. Such proposals are indispensable if we don't want to repeat the sad experience of the original Grain Black Sea Initiative advanced by UN Secretary General Guterres. The initiative was approved in July 2022. A portion of the package focused on promoting Ukrainian grain exports, whilst the second part of it dealt with our grain and fertilizer exports. The Ukrainian portion was operational. We have been honouring our commitments all along. Nothing was done with regard to Russia's interests, set out as obligations assumed by our partners as part of that initiative. Considering this, what we are looking for now are not empty promises, but concrete deeds regarding access to ports, reasonable freight and insurance rates, etc. Our US colleagues are reviewing our proposals. They promised to respond soon. The third topic of our interaction with the Americans is about eliminating irritants that seriously impede the work of our embassy in Washington and the US embassy in Moscow. Clearly, we did not initiate these obstacles. The Obama administration did quite a lot in that regard. We only responded under the diplomatic law of reciprocity, which no one has torn up yet. There was a meeting in Istanbul. Preparations are underway to hold a second one. There are contacts by phone and video conference calls. I'd rather not make any predictions, but we see sign of progress, and our US partners' willingness to lift these obstacles to normal work of diplomats in our respective capitals that are absolutely unacceptable from the point of view of diplomatic practice. Now, before I pass Lavrov's words, and they're very interesting, and they give us a clear understanding of what the Americans and the Russians are actually talking about at the moment, I would like to touch on certain other comments that other Russian officials have made. Firstly, Peskov has spoken about the fact that today, that despite the fact that the Russians have contacted the Americans, and have told the Americans about Ukraine's violations of the energy ceasefire. The Americans have not yet responded. I'm not surprised about that. No one, I think, should be. That's the first thing. Much more important, Sergei Ryabkov, Deputy Foreign Minister, perhaps in some respects the hard man, if I could put it like that, within the Russian Foreign Ministry. He's now given a long interview in which he has said that so far the Russians have not seen from the Americans anything which addresses the genuine issues in the war, the root causes of the conflict, the reason why there is a conflict in Ukraine, all of the many problems that the Russians have discussed on many occasions. All that the Russians have heard about up to now is talk about ceasefires. And this will not do. The Russians are not prepared to simply sit down and talk about ceasefires. They want discussions on the substantive questions about how to move forward to settle this conflict in its entirety. They've said this repeatedly. They're not interested. They don't like this idea that Rubio and Waltz, and to some extent Trump, have been floating about first having a ceasefire and then talking about a final agreement. They don't see that that will work, and they want negotiations now to address the fundamental issues. It makes no sense from their perspective to talk about, to have a ceasefire and then have that ceasefire used by the Ukrainians in the way that the ceasefire after the Minsk agreement was used by the Ukrainians to spin out things, to turn the conflict into a frozen conflict, to do all of those sort of things. So, to quickly say, we see from these comments of Lavrov, and to some extent of Peskov, but definitely from Ryabkov, that despite all of the chatter and talk and concerns that some people have expressed, the Russians have not changed their negotiating strategy. They still insist on fulfillment of the June 2024 terms. They're not prepared to accept a mere ceasefire. If there is going to be a ceasefire, it has to be on the basis of what Putin said, an end to military supplies to Ukraine and of intelligence sharing with Ukraine. That all has to stop. And in addition, there have to be serious negotiations, which the Russians have not yet seen from the Americans, about how to resolve the fundamental, the underlying root causes of the conflict, on which issue, as Wang Yi made clear over the course of his visit to Moscow, the Russians have China's backing. So, let's go back to what Lavrov has said, because as I said, it is interesting, and let's take it step by step. Firstly, the Russians are telling the Americans in no uncertain terms that the Ukrainians are not honouring the ceasefire in terms of attacks on the Russian energy system. The Russians say that they are honouring the ceasefire, but that Ukraine is not honouring the ceasefire. Now, very interestingly, I read an article yesterday in The Guardian which did discuss the ceasefire, amongst many other things in the conflict, and which said that neither side is abiding by the ceasefire. Now, when The Guardian says that neither side is abiding by the ceasefire, it is actually an admission that Ukraine is not abiding by the ceasefire. I'm not, by the way, saying that the Russians have been absolutely pure on this. Lavrov is saying that they've abided by the ceasefire 100%. But when The Guardian says that neither side is abiding by the ceasefire, that is an admission that to some extent, at least, Ukraine is not. And anyway, we'll come to that shortly. So the fact that Ukraine is not abiding by the ceasefire is something the Russians will no doubt want to discuss. The time limit for the ceasefire probably, from a Russian point of view, ends around the 17th or 18th of April. In other words, in about 2 weeks' time. I expect the Russians to continue to abide by the ceasefire during that period. But unless the Americans take steps to stop the Ukrainians from persisting in the attacks on Russia's energy system, my own guess is that in April, after the 17th or 18th of April, the Russians will say that there's no further point. The Ukrainians are not abiding by the ceasefire. There's no reason why they should do so. And that will be the end of the ceasefire. And that will be a significant blow, by the way, for Donald Trump. Now, none of that is surprising. And before I continue, I should just also quickly say that the Russians are also saying that they believe that the Ukrainians have had assistance from the British in particular in violating the ceasefire. I'm not going to try and guess whether that is true. I don't know. The Russians, perhaps unsurprisingly, are blaming the British. I've no information that the British indeed are involved, but I have seen the Russians say it. Anyway, that's on the ceasefire. It is hanging by a thread. The fact that Putin has asked for a report from Belarus about it strongly suggests to me that he's going to tell Trump, he's preparing to tell Trump, look, this isn't working, we can't continue with it. The Ukrainians are doing the same thing that they've always done. They're not abiding by it. That's the ceasefire. Now, on the grain deal, in some ways, Lavrov's words are more interesting because it turns out, if we judge his words objectively, that the Americans made absolutely very clear commitments when they met with the Russians in Riyadh, the meeting between Mr. Anton and Mr. Peake on the American side, and Karasin and Baradai on the Russian side, that they agreed, the Americans made commitments that they would move to get the sanctions on the Russian Agricultural Bank and the sanctions on other Russian financial institutions and the sanctions affecting exports of Russian foodstuffs, including the sanctions that prevent Russian ships which trade in grain and fertilizer, that the Americans made clear commitments to have them to take steps to have them lifted. And it seems that they provided the Russians with some kind of document that effectively confirms that. We supported the US willingness to act in that regard, which was laid out on paper after the March 24th meeting, and have added specific proposals on how this could be done in practice. Now, that doesn't seem to refer to the two readouts that appeared after the meeting, the two American readouts. It looks as if the Russians were given a specific document in which the United States undertook certain commitments in principle to lift various sanctions, to try to get the Europeans to lift various sanctions. And Lavrov is saying that absolutely, if we're going to revive the grain deal, then all of those sanctions do indeed have to be lifted. We understand the problems with the Europeans, and we are providing the Americans with proposals on how these objectives to lift these sanctions, or perhaps to circumvent these sanctions, could be achieved. Now, this is all very interesting, and it does make me wonder whether we're going to see some kind of bilateral agreement between the Americans and the Russians at some point over the next couple of weeks. Maybe the Americans making some provisions to providing Russian ships with banking and insurance services. Just saying. Circumventing the European sanctions. And obviously, if the Russian Agricultural Bank is not reconnected to SWIFT, there would have to be other messaging or payment systems set up. But anybody who thinks that Russia and the United States, two superpowers, are unable to do that, well, I have a bridge to sell them. Now, I'm going to say this. If we start moving in that direction, if the Americans start to take those sort of steps, then the mood in Europe, the feeling in Europe is going to shift to a state of complete panic. It's bad enough that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other. But if they start coming to agreements with each other intended to circumvent EU sanctions, then for the Europeans, that is a disaster. The sanctions themselves will no longer be sustainable. Already there are criticisms in Germany. Certain leading members of the CDU, the new governing party in Germany, though the government has not yet been established, but they're coming out and saying, including the minister-president of the eastern German state of Saxony, they're coming out and saying that it's time to lift the sanctions certainly on Russian energy. They're not proving effective. They're causing all kinds of problems. Members of the SPD, in other words, members of the new coalition government that is forming in Germany, are making those kind of demands. The CDU and SPD leadership, Merz and co., remain dead against all of this. But if the Americans and the Russians start cutting these kind of deals with each other, then the rug will have been pulled completely beneath them. All kinds of countries around the world, if they see American banks processing payments from Russia, are going to start dealing with Russian banks, American banks, in order to facilitate this kind of trade. European states like Hungary and Slovakia are going to start vetoing further sanctions, rollovers, probably Italy too, by the way. We'll start to see the entire sanctions structure in Europe begin to break down. Now, we mustn't get too far ahead of ourselves. Apparently, the Americans made some kind of commitment. The Russians have responded with their own ideas. I don't have the details of those ideas. We'll have to see how this process is taken forward. And of course, it could be that all of this is going to fall apart. So anyway, but let's just keep these possibilities of an American-Russian consensus on this in mind. And Lavrov seems to be much more optimistic that the situation with the embassies is now finally being sorted out. There have been many problems with the two embassies. The Russians and the Americans are going to meet again in Istanbul to see about how to sort out the remaining problems in this process. This is not, by the way, what is being discussed here. There's been some confusion about this, but what is being discussed here is not a second meeting in Riyadh between Karasin and Anton and that group. It's a much more low-level meeting in Istanbul between Russian and American foreign ministry officials to sort out the problems of diplomatic representation by the United States and Russia in each other's countries. But Lavrov seems to be optimistic. He seems to think that all of this continues to make progress. So, what we are seeing at the moment is admissions in Bloomberg about the limitations of American leverage over Russia. Proof from Wang Yi's visit of the strength, the enduring strength of the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, which the two sides are completely committed to. Russian proposals about how to move forward with the Black Sea Initiative, which ought to be ringing alarm bells in Europe, though I don't think that they've been noted properly. And Russian complaints that their concerns about the need to address the underlying problems of the conflict are not being heeded so far in Washington. Now, by this point, I think Donald Trump must have gradually come to understand that any hope he might have had of ending the conflict, or at least the fighting, within 100 days of him becoming president, that's simply unrealistic. It's no more realistic than his expectations that he could do it in one day, which is what he spoke about during the campaign. A substantive negotiation between the United States and Russia, taking this problem forward and looking forward to the security architecture of Europe, is probably the only way to sort this whole issue out diplomatically. And going back to the Russian readout of the conversation between Lavrov and Wang Yi, we see that the Russians and the Chinese are already talking about some new strategic entity in Eurasia, whatever that means, to take the place of the existing structures. That could be a new security architecture, or what will, I think, alarm the United States much more. Perhaps, as I said, the ambiguity is intentional. Some discussion about China and Russia moving forward with something that looks much more like a straightforward alliance. Anyway, let's quickly now move and talk about the military situation on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday I said that there was a pause of one day in attacks by drones on the Russian hinterland. Ukrainian drones had been attacking the Russian hinterland, and Russian drones had not been attacking deep inside Ukraine. Well, whatever that was about, it's over. Yesterday, the Russians conducted a massive drone strike, back with missile strikes in some places against Ukrainian positions right across Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry is, by the way, complaining that there have been more Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy infrastructure. Not, I should say, significant attacks, but nonetheless, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, they did take place. So whatever that pause was about yesterday, it was only a pause. It's certainly not part of any kind of truce. There's no agreement for a truce. Probably there were technical reasons behind it. For all I know, maybe there were weather and cloud conditions. Now, the point is that the Russians are now conducting drone strikes right across the whole of Ukraine every single day. And the size of these drone strikes is growing. I can't give exact estimates of the number of Russian drones, uranium-2 drones, but I understand that on every day now they number in the hundreds. And the Ukrainians are now talking about drone swarms attacking particular facilities in Ukraine. They say that whereas once previously a single drone would attack a target, now a target is more likely to be attacked by hundreds of drones all at the same time, swamping Ukrainian defenses. The reason this is happening is not because the Russians have had some kind of new philosophy of drone warfare. It is because production of uranium-2 drones is increasing all the time and now probably runs into hundreds and perhaps before long thousands a day. I suspect we are nowhere close to the point of the Russians achieving full capacity in terms of uranium-2 drone production. And that enables the Russians to maintain a drone presence over Ukrainian skies every single night and to launch mass attacks on Ukrainian positions or Ukrainian targets night after night with more and more drones, and those drones increasingly operating in swarms. And there's been all kinds of reports about how the drones themselves are becoming more sophisticated, more capable of working through guidance, all sorts of things. Well, I'm not going to discuss that further. There's been also reports of further Russian advances. A group of forces north appears to be saying that the Battle of Guyevo in Kursk region is close to completion. They are also, by the way, in their very latest report, writing as if Basovka, a village in Sumy region, important village in Sumy region, near the main supply road, which is still the main supply road of the Ukrainian forces in this area, including in Sumy region itself, as if Basovka is effectively surrounded by the Russians, which is an interesting revelation if it is true. We are gradually evolving, or so it seems to me, into a position where the Russian offensive in Kursk is becoming a Russian offensive in Sumy region, though it's only a creeping offensive. The Americans talk about it as a sort of creeping lava in terms of the Russian advance right across the battlefronts. But that's certainly what we're looking at, it seems to me, in Kursk and Sumy region for the moment, not perhaps right across the battlefronts. There was a long article in the London Times about the situation in and near Toretsk. It's an interesting article, and it compares strikingly with an article that was published in the Daily Telegraph a few weeks ago. This article in the Daily Telegraph implied that the Battle of Toretsk was still underway and was clearly written in anticipation of the various Ukrainian counterattacks that took place there. This latest article in the Times, the London Times, by contrast, appeared to admitted that the Ukrainians had been pushed to the northern outskirts of Toretsk. It seemed to me like an article intended to prepare the international media for the Ukrainian admission that Donetsk has indeed fallen. Just to say. It also, by the way, acknowledged the terrible losses that the Ukrainians have suffered in this area, as in so many others. And it spoke about how the particular tank unit whose soldiers were being interviewed by the London Times, how there weren't that many of them left anymore, and about how Ukraine has too few soldiers to operate all its tanks, which is quite an interesting admission. Anyway, it's an interesting article. If you want to follow it up, as I said, it is in the London Times. Perhaps the most interesting news, at least for me, is revelations that the Russians are continuing to advance in the Zaporozhye and South Donetsk area. A village called Lobovka has just been captured by the Russians in Zaporozhye. It is located west of Orekhov, and it's been suggested that this attack, this capture, this village, is going to destabilize Ukrainian defenses south of the Dnieper in Zaporozhye region, with the Russians able to start to come close to cutting the connections between Orekhov and the city of Zaporozhye itself. Well, that's perhaps looking at things forward. But it does seem to me that, yet again, the main priority of Russian advances, as it has been basically since the spring of 2024, is this movement, this steady Russian movement westwards from Avdiivka, Ocheretino, through Kurakhovo and Selidovo, onwards, westwards towards Zaporozhye city and to the Dnieper. I spoke yesterday about how the other village of Razliv in southern Donetsk had also fallen, how apparently the Russians have been closing in on the important settlement of Novopavlivka in Dnipro region. To repeat again, this is not my area of expertise, but I'm starting to wonder whether the Russians see this as the main area of operations, the key area of operations, the place where they will achieve their victory, the Schwerpunkt, to use the German expression. In other words, breaking through, battling through to the Dnieper, the area where the Ukrainians are weakest, reaching the Dnieper, reaching Zaporozhye and Dnipro cities on the Dnieper, cutting the Ukrainian communications. Whether that will be the blow that finally breaks Ukraine. Well, we'll discuss that, no doubt, at greater length, perhaps in tomorrow's program as we get more information. But this is where we end our program today. The Russians have lifted the curtain on the state of the negotiations between them and the Americans. It is the negotiations are not, in some respects, as advanced as some would like. We are very, very far, it seems to me, from a ceasefire. But on the question of sanctions relief, they might be much further advanced than some people in in Europe might suppose. Anyway, there it is. Lots going on. It remains a fluid and dynamic situation. We will see what happens today, Liberation Day, what that all comes to. But this is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.